Have you ever stopped to think about why school maps seem to tell only half the truth about the past? What if I told you that, long before Rome or Greece dreamed of empires, there was a throne of ebony and gold that ruled the waves of the Mediterranean Sea? What official history has tried to bury under salt and silence is the existence of an African superpower that dominated the winds, the stars, and the trade of the ancient world with an intelligence that defies our imagination. In this episode, we'll delve into the depths of a forgotten civilization, where black kings and navigators were the true masters of the routes connecting the continents. We'll uncover the mystery of the giants of the sea, colossal ships built with technology that the modern world is only beginning to rediscover, and understand how this spiritual and technical power changed the course of humanity. Prepare for a journey that will transform everything you know about Africa and its connection to the sacred and the invisible. This ancestral revelation is not just about the past, but about who we are today and the strength we carry in our DNA. Understanding this history is like finding a lost compass that guides us back home, to a time when African courage and wisdom illuminated the horizon. That is why stories like this need to be told and preserved, so that the truth is never again swept away by the sands of oblivion. Before we set sail for this epic journey, make sure you're already part of our brotherhood of truth seekers. Have you subscribed to the channel and turned on notifications? Leave a like if you feel the call of this story, and comment below from which part of the world you're hearing this ancestral whisper. We want to know where the voice of our ancestors is echoing today. Many look at the map of the ancient world and see the Mediterranean Sea only as the cradle of Europe, but the truth lies submerged. Before the legions of white marble even dreamed of empire, the African sun already reflected on the blue waters that united three continents in an embrace. It was a time when the south not only looked to the north, but dictated the rhythm of the winds and the trade of souls. The shores of North Africa were a necklace of emeralds and gold, pulsating with the constant movement of majestic fleets. Geographically, the continent was the anchor of the entire known world, serving as the great gateway between the mysteries of the interior and the sea routes. The ocean currents seemed to obey the dark-skinned captains, who knew every reef and every guiding star. Imagine the vibrant ports of Utica and Hippo Regius, where the scent of spices mingled with the saltpeter and sweat of free men. There, geography was not a barrier, but an invitation to the expansion of kingdoms that mastered the art of floating above the abyss. Each African cove held a secret, a promise that the sea belonged to those who respected it as a living god. In this splendid setting, Africa was not merely a neighbor of Europe or Asia. It was the sovereign queen controlling access to the heart of the world. The Mediterranean functioned as a vast ancestral marketplace, where African wisdom flowed as easily as water slips through one's fingers. Whoever controlled the coast held the destiny of all nations dependent on wheat and metal. However, this absolute dominion over the sapphire horizon was not born of chance, but of a much older and deeper heritage. While other civilizations still feared the monsters of the deep, Africans were already deciphering the ocean's codes with almost divine precision. But where did this technical knowledge, capable of bending the waves to the will of kings, come from? Legend has it that the Azure Sea was not a barrier, but rather the backyard for the great kingdoms that flourished on the sacred soil of Africa. Long before modern maps were drawn with blood and ink, the sapphire horizon was the domain of peoples who saw the waves as living highways. They did not fear the abyss. On the contrary, they conversed with the tides as if they were old acquaintances, whispering secrets to the wind that blew from the desert. But you know how it is. The history they tell us in books seems to have suffered a convenient blackout, leaving these navigators in the shadows of oblivion. While the rest of the world was still groping in the dark, North Africa was already pulsating with vibrant ports that connected the heart of the continent to the rest of humanity. There was a mystery in the way they moved, a confidence that only those who possessed the keys to the oceanic gates could boast before other kingdoms. Imagine the sound of the waters lapping against hulls of fine wood, carrying the scent of incense and the gleam of gold to the squares where the fate of the world was decided. Geography was not a cruel obstacle. It was the very throne of a civilization that saw the Mediterranean as a mirror of its own spiritual and political greatness. Each ship that departed from the African coast carried more than merchandise. It carried the essence of a people who governed the currents. For these ancestors, the sea was a sacred organism, a blue god that demanded respect, but also offered safe passage to those who knew how to read the signs of the clouds. African dominion over these waters was not merely a matter of boats and oars, but rather a mystical connection to the rhythms of the planet, something we can barely comprehend today. They were the true architects of global trade, weaving a network that embraced entire continents with the force of their presence. However, this mastery of the sapphire horizon didn't appear out of nowhere, as if it had magically fallen from the sky. There is a spiritual lineage, a technical knowledge passed down orally that dates back to even older and more mysterious expeditions into the unknown. It's as if these sailors were the direct heirs of a tradition that sought the sacred in distant lands long before the first port was built. There was a time when the desert sands and the sea foam told the same story, a lineage of explorers that knew no bounds. They were the heirs of traditions so ancient that time itself seems to have lost count, direct descendants of travelers who sought the land of Punt. This connection to the sacred was not just a bedtime story, but the basis of a naval engineering that defied the logic of neighboring peoples. The mystery lies in how these ancient sailors transformed the search for the divine into a flawless and secret science of navigation. While many saw the ocean as a graveyard of souls, for the heirs of these expeditions, each wave was a portal to hidden knowledge and riches beyond imagination. They carried on their maps not only routes, but spiritual coordinates that linked the Red Sea to the depths of the Great Green Mediterranean. Imagine the gleam in the priests' eyes as they saw the ships laden with rare resins and ebony, the fruits of a journey that uniquely united the physical and the spiritual. The journey was not merely commercial, it was a symbolic pilgrimage where mastery of the waters represented mastery over the very elements of nature. The technology of their hulls and sails was a closely guarded secret, a technical heritage that flowed through the blood of lineages of navigators. In this spiritual unfolding, each expedition was preceded by rituals that harmonized the steel of human will with the fluidity of ancestral marine deities. It was not merely about floating, but about entering into communion with the spirit of the waters, ensuring that Africa was the beacon guiding the ancient world. This sacred knowledge allowed them to traverse distances that others considered impossible, expanding the boundaries of what was believed to be the end of the world. But this thirst for discovery and this technical heritage would eventually find new fertile ground, where a legendary city would rise to challenge all empires. What began as a search for sacred lands and divine spices was about to transform into the birth of a power that would shake the world. The secret to founding a new maritime kingdom was just waiting for the breath of a visionary queen to manifest itself on the African coast. They say the destiny of an empire can be traced in the gaze of a woman who refuses to be silenced. The legendary Queen Dido, fleeing betrayals in distant lands, sought not only refuge, but the perfect womb to give birth to a new era, Carthage. In the fertile lands of North Africa, she found not empty soil, but an ancestry already pulsating with the power of the waters, ready to be shaped by her vision. The mystery of this foundation lies not only in coins and stones, but in the spiritual pact sealed between the newcomers and the African land that welcomed them. It is said that local wisdom transformed the travelers' legacy into something much greater, a symbiosis that gave rise to an unprecedented maritime superpower. Carthage was not just a city, it was a jewel embedded in the coast, a revealed secret that would make the northern kingdoms look south with a mixture of covetousness and fear. Carthage's symbolic journey began with the trade in purple dye and the brilliance of knowledge, creating a network of influence that enveloped the Mediterranean like a royal cloak. In its streets, the scent of the sea mingled with the aroma of lost libraries, where nautical knowledge was cultivated like a state religion. They were not merely building walls, but invisible bridges of power connecting the heart of Africa to the most distant ports of Europe and Asia. On a spiritual level, the city became the epicenter of rituals, honoring the life force and the sovereignty of the seas, under the watchful eye of deities who protected the merchants. Each stone laid in its ports carried the intention of a civilization that saw itself as the guardian of global roots. The founding of Carthage was the awakening of an African giant who understood that whoever governs the ports governs the soul of the known world, transforming the sea into an empire of silk and iron. This grandeur, however, depended not only on high walls or golden temples, but on something far more dynamic and technological that sailed across the blue abyss. As Carthage grew, its naval engineers developed construction secrets that would make their ships seem like living, invincible creatures in the eyes of their enemies. The true power of this civilization was hidden in the wooden beams and the designs of colossal machines that were about to change the rules of naval warfare forever. In the docks of Carthage, the sound wasn't that of ordinary hammers, but of an orchestra of engineers who seemed to read the thoughts of the water. They created what the ancient world called giants, colossal ships with 5 rows of oars that moved with the precision of a spiritual clock. African engineering didn't just seek to float, it sought to master the rhythm of the tides with a fitting technology that allowed the construction of entire fleets in record time, as if they were pieces of a divine puzzle. The secret behind this supremacy lay in standardization. Each wooden beam was marked with ancient symbols, allowing any ship to be assembled or repaired in any African port. While foreign navigators relied on luck, the masters of Carthage used instruments that seemed magical to laymen, reading the stars and currents with mathematical precision. This technical knowledge was guarded under sacred oaths, ensuring that the design of their keels would never fall into enemy hands, keeping Africa one step ahead of any threat. Imagine the sight of those galleys on the horizon, their bronze-reinforced prows gleaming like the sun, ready to shatter anyone who dared challenge their path. The ships were seen as extensions of the sailors' bodies, a symbolic journey where metal and wood became flesh and spirit in pursuit of glory. On board, the rowers' rhythm was dictated by chants that harmonized human strength with the heartbeat of the earth, creating a vibration that could be felt even before the ship was sighted. Spiritually, each launch of a new ship into the sea was a baptism, a ceremony of surrender where permission was requested from the entities of the abyss so that the African wood could cross the borders of the blue. They believed that the intelligence to create such machines came directly from the breath of the ancestors, transforming naval science into an act of continuous worship. To have control of the waters meant being the guardian of the balance between peoples, maintaining peace through a technical force that no one dared question in open battle. However, all this engineering and military power needed protection that human eyes could not see, something that inhabited the invisible realms. Behind every technical innovation and every successful voyage, there was a silent pact sealed in the temples, invoking forces that governed not only the waves, but the very fortune of nations. The gods of the waters were about to reveal their faces, demanding a devotion that fused the destiny of sailors with the unfathomable mystery of the deities. In the heart of the great port cities, the air vibrated with an energy that came not only from commerce, but from the constant presence of the sacred. For African navigators, the sea was the territory of powerful deities such as Tanit, the lunar face that shone upon the waters, and Baal-Hamon, the lord of fire and fertility. This pact with the gods of the waters was not a casual choice, but a profound commitment that ensured each expedition was protected by forces that governed the cosmos itself. The mystery of these cults lay in how spirituality intertwined with survival on the ocean, where a simple misjudgment could mean the end. Before the anchors were raised, complex rituals were performed to invoke the favorable breath, transforming the ship's deck into a floating altar. It was believed that deities inhabited the deepest currents, and only those who followed the ancestral laws of respect and sacrifice would receive the key to cross the abyss without being swallowed. This symbolic journey led sailors to see the Mediterranean as a living temple, where each storm was a test of faith and each calm a divine blessing. The African gods were not distant figures sitting on mountains. They traveled alongside the crew, manifesting themselves in the flight of seabirds and the shimmer of the foam. Devotion was the fuel that sustained the men's courage amidst the vast blue expanse, creating an unbreakable bond between the fleet's destiny and the will of the unseen. Spiritually, mastery of the waters was seen as a sign of divine approval, proof that African civilization was chosen to mediate the encounter between worlds. In coastal temples, priestesses interpreted the signs of the tides, dictating the exact moment when the gates of the sea would open to the glory of Carthage and its allies. This mystical connection provided a stability that purely military empires could never achieve, for its strength came from an eternal and indomitable source. However, this divine protection and the wealth generated by the sea awakened a thirst for luxury that only the most exclusive trade could satisfy. The ships returning from expeditions brought with them colors and materials the world had never seen, transforming the African kingdoms into the sole holders of treasures coveted by all the kings of antiquity. The secret to absolute wealth was kept in a rare dye and precious metals that only the southern navigators knew where to find and how to extract. There was a color worth more than gold itself, a secret kept in the depths of shells that only African divers dared to seek. The monopoly on purple and the control of gold routes transformed North Africa into the vault of the ancient world, where wealth was not just paper, but tangible power. Each ship that docked carried with it the weight of sovereignty, financing temples that dazzled the eyes of any foreign traveler who dared to land on its shores. The mystery behind this immense fortune was how they protected their sources, creating legends about sea monsters to keep the curious away from the most lucrative routes. While other kingdoms fought over scraps of land, African lords controlled the flow of everything considered luxurious and sacred in the courts of every continent. The truth is that the Mediterranean economy pulsed to the rhythm of Carthage's fleets, and no king, from east to west, could maintain his splendor without the approval of the merchants from the south. This symbolic journey transformed the continent into a magnet for prosperity, where ivory, ebony, and precious stones flowed like rivers toward global markets. Africa was not merely a supplier, it was the architect of a trading system so sophisticated that Carthaginian coins were accepted in places where the alphabet was still a mystery. African luxury defined civilization, shaping the tastes of emperors and changing the course of wars through sheer economic power. On a spiritual level, this abundance was seen as a reflection of the generosity of the earth and sea towards those who knew how to honor their cycles without blind greed. Gold was not just metal. It was the sun's brilliance captured to glorify the gods and ancestors who allowed such greatness. Prosperity was a sign of cosmic balance, proof that the alliance between the men of the sea and the forces of nature was stronger than ever, sustaining an empire of light. But this immense wealth circulating in the ports wasn't confined to the sandy coast. It extended along invisible trails that cut through the interior of the continent. Silent connections existed, ivory bridges linking the waves of the Mediterranean to the deep forests and forgotten kingdoms of the African heartland. What was seen on the surface was only the tip of a much vaster and more mysterious network, carrying secrets from places the rest of the world didn't even suspect existed. Behind the curtains of salt and the roar of the waves, there were paths that foreign maps never dared to draw. They were ivory connections, invisible trails that pulsed like veins, linking the African ports of the Mediterranean to the secret civilizations hidden in the depths of the savannas and forests. This constant exchange meant that the coastal cities were, in fact, the great gateways to a continent that breathed knowledge and resources far beyond what Greek or Roman eyes could see. The mystery of these routes lay in the absolute silence of the guides and merchants who protected the location of the inland kingdoms as if they were sacred treasures. While the world believed the desert to be an insurmountable barrier, Africans used secret land navigation techniques that transformed the dunes into extensions of the sea itself. Revealing these connections meant surrendering the soul of Africa to the invader. Therefore, each caravan that reached the coast carried with it not only merchandise, but the weight of an ancient secret. In this symbolic journey, ivory and ebony were not merely luxury items, but messengers of a continental unity ignored by the rest of the world. The sophistication of these inland kingdoms merged with the naval mastery of the coast, creating a symbiosis where the strength of the land sustained the power of the ocean. It was a dance of exchanges that carried the astronomical knowledge of the south to the sailors of the north, ensuring that Africa's spiritual compass was always pointed towards greatness. Spiritually, it was believed that these routes were protected by ancestors who watched over the travelers' steps between the known and unknown worlds. The flow of wealth was seen as a gift from the spirits of the land, who only allowed passage to those who knew the words of power and the rituals of protection. This balance between the coast and the heartland maintained Africa as the true center of gravity of the ancient world, a vast body connected by threads of intelligence and faith. However, this web of power and mystery that enveloped the continent did not go unnoticed by those who dreamed of total world domination. A monumental challenge was looming on the horizon, personified in a lineage of warriors who would transform the art of war into a hymn of African resistance. The name of a family of lions was about to echo through the mountains and seas, bringing forth a general whose tactical genius would make the foundations of Europe tremble beneath his feet. There was a time when the name of one man could silence the Roman Senate and make the Mediterranean Sea hold its breath. Hannibal Barca was not just a general. He was the heir to a lineage of African lions who swore to protect the sovereignty of their waters and their land at any cost. With a military genius that seemed inspired by ancient gods, he transformed the despair of a people into an epic march that defied the very nature and logic of war. The mystery surrounding his figure lies in his almost supernatural ability to foresee the movements of his enemies even before they were planned. Legends say that he possessed strategic secrets passed down by priests, allowing him to lead elephants and armies through paths where the world believed there was only the white death of snow. Hannibal did not fight only for territory. He fought to keep alive the flame of an Africa that did not bow before the Roman eagle that sought to dominate the horizon. This symbolic journey took African warriors to the heart of Europe, showing that the sea they ruled was only the beginning of their influence. Hannibal's audacity in taking the war to the enemy's gates was an act of spiritual revelation, proving that the power of the African will was capable of bending giants. He used geography to his advantage, transforming every valley and every river into a deadly trap for those who underestimated the intelligence and resilience coming from the south. In the spiritual realm, Hannibal was seen as the right-hand man of Baal Hammon, an instrument of divine justice against the arrogance of those who wanted to erase African culture. Each of his victories was celebrated in the temples of Carthage as confirmation that the ancestors still walked among the living, whispering strategies in the ears of the righteous. He personified the resilience of a continent that, even under constant pressure, always found a way to be reborn and defy the destiny imposed by others. However, the marks of this war were not only recorded on battlefields or in history books written by the victors. The true power of that era left silent traces, structures that time has not been able to completely devour and that today emerge from the depths. There are hidden ports and submerged cities that hold physical proof that, before Roman rule, African architecture and navy had already achieved what many considered impossible. Beneath the murky waters that now wash the coasts of Tunisia and Libya lie secrets that time has tried, but failed, to completely dissolve. These are the hidden ports, structures of such advanced engineering that they seem to have been erected by the hands of giants under the command of philosopher kings. These submerged cities are not merely ruins, they are time capsules that hold proof that Africa possessed naval arsenals and circular ports capable of sheltering hundreds of ships in absolute secrecy. The mystery of these places lies in the fact that many have been erased from official maps, as if the world wanted to forget the magnitude of African infrastructure. Archaeologists are now diving in search of answers, finding perfectly aligned keys and protective mechanisms that challenge what we know about antiquity. The revelation is clear. The power of Carthage and its allies was not a matter of chance, but of urban and maritime planning that transformed the coast into an insurmountable fortress. This symbolic journey through the depths leads us to imagine the frenetic movement of these ports, where the sound of the currents and the creaking of the timbers created a symphony of power and progress. Each hidden port functioned as a center of intelligence, where knowledge about the sea was processed and distributed among the fleets that kept the Mediterranean under control. It was an invisible network of safe harbors that allowed Africa to cast its shadow over all the shores of the sea, from Gibraltar to the Levant. In the spiritual realm, these structures were consecrated to the deities of the abyss, serving as sanctuaries where the sea and the land merged into a single protective force. It was believed that, as long as these ports stood, the essence of African civilization would remain untouched by the storms of foreign politics. The silence that now envelops these ruins is, in fact, an ancestral whisper awaiting the right moment to reveal the true scale of black sovereignty over the Great Green. But what truly made these ships and ports special was not just the stone or the wood, but the sacred symbolism that each sailor carried with them. Even before looking to the stars, they sought protection in markings and amulets that connected their physical journey to the invisible world of spirits. On the prows of the ships, designs appeared that were not mere ornaments, but watchful eyes that guarded the unknown and guided the fleet through the mists of destiny. On the prows of the great African galleys, what appeared to be mere art was in fact a spiritual sentinel that never blinked. Painted with vibrant colors extracted from sacred minerals, the eyes of the ships, known as the Eyes of Horus or the protective symbols of Tanit, watched over the blue abyss in search of hidden dangers. These symbols on the sails were not mere aesthetic whims, but mystical compasses that connected the ship's destiny to the watchful gaze of the gods, ensuring that the sea recognized the authority of those who sailed it. The mystery of these symbols lay in the belief that the ship itself possessed a soul, a living entity that needed to be awakened through rituals of consecration and marks of power. Sailors throughout the Mediterranean trembled at the sight of these African vessels, for they believed that the painted eyes could see beyond the horizon and foresee storms sent by evil spirits. A forgotten truth was revealed there. For the African navigator, the technology of wood was useless if it was not in harmony with the sacred geometry that governs the invisible. This symbolic journey transformed each crossing into an act of faith, where the ivory and terracotta amulets hanging from the masts served as lightning rods against the fury of the ocean. The prow not only cut through the waves, it opened spiritual paths in territories where other peoples were lost amidst fear and superstition. The use of these sacred images created a psychological and spiritual barrier, affirming that the fleet was protected by a wisdom that predated the very creation of the sea. On a spiritual level, these symbols represented the awakening of hidden knowledge, the idea that African man possessed the necessary vision to govern the chaos of the waters. Each line and each color carried the weight of ancestral prophecies and protections, transforming the ship into a mobile temple that carried the presence of the gods beyond the borders of the sun. Whoever controlled the symbolism of the sea controlled the very narrative of reality, for the images spoke a universal language that fear respected and courage embraced. However, behind every symbol and every audacious maneuver, there was a cold and calculating mind that read the sky with a precision that official history has tried to erase. In the secret rooms of the temples and on the upper decks, men of profound knowledge guarded the true library of the tides, a knowledge that went far beyond superstition. These were astronomical secrets and current maps that allowed Africans to predict the mood of the ocean with an accuracy that seemed, to the eyes of laymen, pure magic. In the shadowy halls of coastal temples and on command decks, knowledge was not merely heard, but read in the rhythms of the universe. There existed the Library of the Tides, an invisible repository of astronomical wisdom guarded by priest navigators who treated the sky as a sacred map. They did not merely look up, they deciphered the language of the stars to predict the mood of the waters, transforming the movement of the celestial bodies into precise routes that traversed the Mediterranean with an accuracy that other nations did not even dare to imagine. The mystery of these wise men lay in their ability to sense the arrival of storms days before the first lightning bolt touched the horizon, as if their bodies were attuned to the planet's breathing. While sailors from other kingdoms were lost in the middle of the ocean when clouds obscured the sun, Africans used secret instruments and mathematical calculations that archaeology is now beginning to rediscover with astonishment. This hidden science allowed them to navigate at night, guided by a mystical connection between the fire of the stars and the saltpeter of the depths. This symbolic journey of knowledge transformed navigation into a form of high scientific magic, where each ocean current was mapped like a vein in the body of a living god. African captains possessed scrolls detailing the cycles of the moon and its absolute influence on the tides, a secret that gave them an unbeatable strategic advantage in battles and trade. They were masters of time and space on the waves, moving with a confidence that only absolute truth can provide an explorer. Spiritually, this wisdom was believed to be a gift from Thoth and other deities of intellect, proof that the African mind was the beacon illuminating the darkness of the unknown. The Library of the Tides was not made merely of paper, but of ancestral memories transmitted through initiation rites that prepared the young sailor to read the invisible. Mastering astronomy was, for them, a form of worship, as understanding the laws of the heavens was the first step in governing the destinies of land and sea. However, this intellectual brilliance and unquestionable sovereignty over world trade routes would eventually attract the fury of a world that could not bear to live in the shadow of Carthage's greatness. What began as a commercial competition was about to become the greatest and most violent clash of antiquity, where the very existence of African memory would be put to the test. The clash of civilizations was knocking at the door, and what was at stake was not only control of the sea, but who would have the right to write the history of the centuries to come. What the sands of time try to hide is that the Punic Wars were not merely battles for land and taxes, but a brutal clash between two ways of existing. On one side, young and hungry Rome. On the other, the sophistication of an African empire that for centuries had dictated the rhythm of the world through the sea. It was not just a dispute over ports, but a systematic attempt to erase the hegemony of a people who treated the waters as their sacred property and the cradle of their power. The mystery that official chronicles avoid addressing is the scale of Roman hatred, which was not satisfied with victory, but needed to demonize every aspect of Carthaginian culture to justify its fury. The destruction was planned so that future generations would see Africa only as a periphery and not as the technological and spiritual metropolis that it truly was. Here is revealed one of the greatest erasures of humanity, the moment when the victor's pen began to cross out the names of African masters from the pages of glory. This symbolic journey across the battlefields shows us that, even in the face of military defeat, the essence of Carthage endured in every sailor who refused to surrender their maps. The war transformed the Mediterranean into a graveyard of proud ships, but the currents continued to whisper the names of the black generals and heroes who made the world tremble. The conflict was a test of resilience, where European brute force attempted to crush the elegance and strategic intelligence that came from African soil. On a spiritual level, this clash was seen as a cosmic struggle between the order imposed by the sword and the harmony maintained by the balance of the ancient gods. African war rituals sought the protection of ancestors, invoking forces that Rome, in its arrogance, called superstition, but which it secretly feared encountering on the field of honor. The fall of Carthage was the sacrifice of an era, an eclipse that plunged African nautical knowledge into a period of forced silence, but not of definitive death. But before the final fire consumed the city, profound rituals were performed so that the soul of that people would be preserved in the invisible. There was a force that not even the legions of marble could touch, the sacred fire that burned on the altars and that demanded a courage that transcended life itself. This purifying fire, shrouded in mysteries that many today prefer not to discuss, was what ensured that the legacy of maritime Africa would never be completely extinguished from the shadows of time. In the heart of Carthage's temples, the brilliance came not only from gold, but from a flame that seemed to breathe. The sacred fire of Moloch and the aromatic smoke rising from the altars were not mere rituals of fear, but acts of extreme purification to keep the city in harmony with the cosmos. Before any great journey or decisive battle, leaders and people united in total surrender, believing that the fire had the power to transmute human weakness into divine and unwavering strength. The mystery surrounding these practices has been distorted for centuries, painting a picture of cruelty where, in reality, there existed a profound devotion and a sense of duty towards the unseen. Revealed here is the hidden face of a spirituality that did not fear sacrifice in the name of the collective, where fire was seen as the great liberator of the soul. While enemies saw only smoke and shadows, Africans perceived the cleansing necessary for their civilization to continue governing the currents of the world, with hands cleansed of spiritual impurities. This symbolic journey led the devotee to a state of ecstasy, where physical pain was overcome by the vision of an eternal Africa, protected by the flames of truth. The sacred fire functioned as an invisible beacon, an anchor of light that kept the identity of a people connected to their deepest roots, even when the waters became turbulent. It was the certainty that through the flame, the spirit of the ancestors would remain alive, circulating in the veins of every warrior and navigator who bore the name of the city. Spiritually, the ritual was a way of sealing the pact of sovereignty, ensuring that the sea would continue to be a faithful servant of the children of Tanit and Baal. The energy generated in these temples was what fueled Hannibal's courage and the astronomer's precision, creating a mystical shield that Rome took decades to crack. The sacred fire was the soul of Carthage manifested, an indomitable element that promised rebirth even in the face of the coldest ashes of material destruction. However, when final defeat loomed, the victors were not content to extinguish the flames. They needed to assassinate the reputation of those who had kindled them. For Rome to shine alone, it was necessary to create a narrative where the black navigators were seen as villains devoid of humanity. What followed was one of the greatest smear campaigns in history, transforming a civilization of geniuses into a tale of barbarity, so that the world would forget who truly taught the Mediterranean to navigate. You know how it is. History is always written by those who wield the sword, and Rome showed no mercy. After the fires of the Punic Wars subsided, an even crueler war began, that of systematic erasure. The victors strove to transform the black navigators into cruel barbarians or lawless pirates, all so that no one would remember that, for centuries, Europe was merely a shadow compared to the technological brilliance of Carthage. The Roman distortion was so profound that future generations came to believe that civilization only came from the north, ignoring the African roots that already nourished the world. The mystery here is not only what was destroyed, but what was deliberately altered to serve a new empire. They took the maps, the routes, and even the African gods and gave them new names, stealing the authorship of inventions that changed humanity. It reveals a historical crime where the nautical intelligence and cultural sophistication of Africa were buried under a mountain of lies and prejudices. It was necessary to make the world believe that the Mediterranean had always been a European lake, even if the waves still carried the scent of ebony and ivory. In this symbolic journey through wounded memory, we realize that the official narrative functions as a veil that obscures the truth about who truly controlled the winds. Each statue toppled and each library burned on African soil were attempts to kill the spirit of a race that dared to be greater than the destiny imposed by others. Rome's fear was not merely military. It was the fear that the wisdom of the South would be recognized as the true source of modern civilization. They knew that as long as Africa was seen as the savage other, their own glory would be secure. Spiritually, this distortion acted as a curse of forgetfulness, attempting to sever the umbilical cord that linked the children of the diaspora to their heritage of kings and sailors. The silence imposed on African maritime conquests attempted to plant the idea that the sea was never the place of black people, a lie that echoes to this day. But the truth is stubborn. And even under layers of dust and salt, the essence of African power remains vibrating deep within the collective consciousness. They could burn the paper, but they could never erase the memory that the land itself guarded with such zeal. However, the secrets of these navigators were too vast to remain confined to the limits of the Mediterranean. There are whispered hints, carried by even older winds, that African fleets did not stop at the Pillars of Hercules, where the world supposedly ended. A trail of mysteries points westward, crossing the abyss of the Atlantic long before any European caravel dreamed of leaving port. What these sailors found beyond the forbidden horizon is what begins to unravel an even deeper and more forbidden connection. They say the ocean has no memory, but the currents that depart from the African coast hold secrets that official history trembles to mention. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where the ancient world swore life ended, the navigators of Carthage and even older kingdoms saw only a new beginning. There is a trail of clues whispered by Atlantic winds, suggesting that black prows cut through the waters westward long before any European map was drawn. This forbidden connection is the nightmare of those who defend a late discovery of the Americas. For Africa already knew the breadth of distant lands. The mystery lies in artifacts and legends that connect the two sides of the Blue Abyss in a way that traditional archaeology struggles to explain without admitting the obvious. How to explain the presence of plants and metals that would only cross the sea centuries later, if not by the hands of those who already governed the tides with divine mastery? The revelation is that the Atlantic was not a wall, but a bridge for these ancestors who sought the sun, where it sets with the same courage with which they followed it in the desert. They carried with them not only goods, but the seed of a spirituality that seems to have blossomed in foreign soil in mysterious ways. This symbolic journey invites us to reimagine the world as a far more connected and African place than textbooks dare to admit. Imagine the great fleets of ivory and gold anchoring on unknown shores, exchanging knowledge with peoples who recognized in them the dignity of gods from the sea. African influence in the Atlantic is a puzzle of scattered pieces, where naval engineering and astronomical knowledge enabled voyages that modern science has only recently begun to validate. It was a silent expansion, driven by curiosity and the search for harmony with the unknown, far from ambitions of bloody conquest. Spiritually, this crossing represented the triumph of the soul over fear, the belief that the gods of Africa also inhabited the waters where the sun sleeps. The use of identical symbols and rituals that echo across continents suggests that African wisdom was sown by the wind, creating a protective web that embraced the planet. It was believed that ancestors traveled on the currents, guiding ships to ports where life pulsed in new colors and forms. This spiritual unity across the ocean's shores proves that Africa was never isolated, but rather at the center of a global dialogue that was interrupted by forced forgetfulness. However, this majestic presence was not merely a matter of navigation, but of a cultural exchange that shaped the very soul of what we call classical civilization. While African fleets explored the West, their influence in the North, in Greece and Rome, was so profound that it became invisible due to its omnipresence. What we now call European philosophy, art and architecture has roots that delve deep into the fertile soil of North Africa. There is a hidden cultural blending that reveals how the masters of the African sea were, in fact, the true tutors of the thought that the modern world so exalts. You know how it is. We often hear that Greece was the cradle of everything, but the truth is that this cradle was rocked by African hands. During the centuries of maritime dominance, the ports of Carthage and Alexandria were the true universities of the world, where philosophers and artists from the north sought the light that the south radiated. This cultural mixing was the silent engine that shaped the architecture, thought, and even the fashion of the civilizations we now call classical. What many see as European originality is, in fact, a profound echo of the sophistication that crossed the sea in ebony ships. The mystery lies in how these roots have been whitewashed by time, transforming African masters into mere extras in someone else's history. When we look at the columns of temples or the logic of ancient laws, we are seeing the legacy of an Africa that taught the world to organize itself and to think about life beyond the obvious. What is revealed here is an exchange where knowledge had no borders, and African intelligence was the most valuable currency in any marketplace of ideas. They didn't just bring goods, they brought the order, the aesthetics, and the science that allowed Europe to finally awaken from its primitive slumber. In this symbolic journey, we realize that the Mediterranean was a great table of dialogue where Africa sat at the head, dictating the course of civilization. Its influence extended from the way of navigating by the stars to the mysteries of mathematics and medicine, which flourished in the continent's warmth before cooling on foreign marble. Each so-called classic discovery carries the DNA of a people who understood that culture is like water. It flows, nourishes, and transforms everything it touches. Maritime Africa was the beating heart of this global body, pumping wisdom to all corners of the known world. On a spiritual level, this blending of knowledge created a web of beliefs, where African gods walked disguised among the myths of other lands. The wisdom of Egyptian and Carthaginian mysteries infiltrated the religious practices of Rome and Greece, giving them a depth they did not possess on their own. It was a sacred union between heaven and earth, where Africa provided the mystical foundation for humanity to understand the divine. This invisible connection proves that modern spirituality is indebted to rituals and concepts that were born under the African sun, long before they were translated into other languages. However, this harmony was broken by salt and fire, leaving a trail of silence where before there had been the sound of majestic fleets and victory chants. The trauma of Carthage's total destruction was not merely physical. It was an attempt to salt the soul of a continent so that nothing else would grow there. The salty silence that followed the fall of the great navigators is one of the darkest chapters of our journey, a trauma that still echoes in the depths of time. But what Rome did not know is that salt, though it burns, also preserves what lies hidden beneath the surface. They say trauma smells of the sea and tastes of burnt earth. When Rome finally managed to subdue Carthage, the order was cruel and absolute. It wasn't enough to tear down the walls. It was necessary to erase the soul of the place. The victors spread tons of salt over the African soil, a somber ritual to ensure that nothing would ever sprout there again. No plants, no memories, no power. The salty silence that followed was the first great erasure of our history, a desperate attempt to bury the greatness of a people beneath a white and infertile desert. The mystery of this destruction lies in the fact that, although the city fell, what it represented was too vast to be contained by salt. They tried to transform the cradle of the World Navy into a death camp, but the ocean currents continued carrying the stories of the sailors who did not surrender. The revelation is that the salt of Rome could not dry the blood of the kings and navigators who had already spread its essence throughout the ancient world. What was meant to be a definitive end became, ironically, the moment when the seed of African resistance was planted in the invisible, awaiting the right time to germinate again. This symbolic journey across the salty soil makes us feel the weight of an empire that preferred emptiness to coexisting with the greatness of others. Imagine the cries of waves crashing against empty harbors, while libraries and naval records were consumed by the flames of ignorance and fear. But even amidst the ashes, the architecture of African intelligence remained engraved in the minds of those who survived, carrying the secrets of the stars far from the hands of the invaders. Salt could hinder the growth of wheat, but it could never stop the circulation of wisdom that had already crossed oceans and borders. On a spiritual level, this silence was a period of forced gestation, where the power of maritime Africa retreated to the depths of its people's souls. It was believed that the gods of the waters had withdrawn to the abyssal currents, taking with them the keys to forbidden knowledge until humanity was ready to hear them again. Salt became a symbol of mystical preservation. What was hidden there did not rot. It merely waited for the moment to be revealed. This trauma generated a force of resilience that would define African identity in the following centuries. The capacity to be reborn from the most arid lands. However, this wisdom was not merely buried in the ruins of a city, it traveled with the winds and the people, transforming into a diaspora of knowledge. Even without their great ports, African sailors continued to be the invisible guides of humanity, spreading seeds of spirituality and technique to every shore they touched. What seemed to be the end of an era was, in fact, the beginning of a silent infiltration of the African soul into the DNA of all modern cultures, leaving a trail of light that the world is still trying to map. You know how it is, paper can burn, but the knowledge that travels in the blood is impossible to erase. Even with the ashes of Carthage still warm, the masters of the sea did not disappear into nothingness. They became a diaspora of knowledge, carrying with them the keys to the stars and the secrets of the currents to every corner of the Mediterranean and beyond. Wherever there was a port, there was the silent trail of an African navigator teaching how to read the winds, infiltrating the intelligence of the South into the DNA of new nations that were emerging. The mystery of this dispersal lies in how Africa's nautical and spiritual knowledge was camouflaged to survive Roman persecution. Priests and sailors disguised their rituals in everyday practices, ensuring that the moral and technical compass of their ancestors continued to guide humanity, even without an official throne. This reveals an invisible network of influence, where Africa, even defeated on the map, remained the intellectual mentor of all peoples who dared to challenge the blue horizon. In this symbolic journey, the seeds of African wisdom sprouted in unexpected places, influencing everything from the construction of new fleets to the organization of commercial laws that we use to this day. The essence of what Carthage was did not die. It multiplied, transforming itself into a silent ferment that gave flavor and structure to the nautical culture of the entire world. Maritime Africa proved that its true empire was not made of stone, but of a fluid intelligence that no border or army could contain for long. On a spiritual level, this diaspora represented the spread of a faith that sees the divine in motion, in the eternal dance between man and nature. Protective rituals, amulets, and reverence for the waters were adopted by fishermen and sailors of diverse lineages, creating a mystical brotherhood that unites the shores of the sea to this day. The African soul became the secret guardian of the ports, a spirit that whispers courage in the ears of those who face the unknown, keeping alive the flame of that ancient connection with the sacred. But this story didn't just remain in dusty books or coral-covered ruins. It pulsates here and now, right under our noses. The echo of these ancient waves can still be felt in how we connect with our roots and in how African courage continues to defy the seas of injustice and oblivion. There is an awakening happening, a moment when the ancient blue throne of Africa begins to emerge from the depths of modern consciousness, revealing truths that change everything we think about who we are. You know how it is, time may pass, but the sea never forgets who once owned it. Today, when we look at the waves of the Mediterranean, we are not just seeing water, but the vibrant echo of an era when Africa dictated the rhythm of the winds and the destiny of nations. This echo in the waves survives in nautical aesthetics, in the courage of the fishermen, and in the strength of the diaspora that, even after centuries of forced silence, keeps alive the flame of that maritime sovereignty in its own identity and faith. The mystery that is beginning to unfold in our time is the resurgence of this hidden truth, challenging the official history that tried to convince us that Africa has always been confined to the land. Underwater archaeologists and truth seekers are rediscovering that the strategic intelligence and technological sophistication of these ancient navigators are the roots of much of what we call modern progress. An unbreakable connection between the glorious past and the present is revealed, showing that the African soul possesses an inner compass that always points towards greatness, no matter how deep the attempt to erase it. In this symbolic journey, we realize that the legacy of the Lords of the Waters is not merely a museum piece, but a tool of power for the modern world. The awareness that our ancestors ruled the most important sea of antiquity restores to black people their rightful place as architects of global civilization. It is a rediscovery that carries with it the scent of ebony and the brilliance of purple, reminding each of us that the horizon has never been a limit, but rather an invitation to expansion and to mastering our own destiny. On a spiritual level, this awakening is like the return of a deity that was merely resting at the bottom of the ocean. The ancestral reverence for the forces of nature and the balance between technology and the sacred regain meaning in a world that desperately seeks to reconnect the human with the divine. The African legacy teaches us that to govern the external world, one must first understand the currents that flow within us, maintaining calm amidst the storm and clear vision in the fog of uncertainty. But this whole story doesn't end here, with our feet in the sand and our eyes on the past. It's the fuel for what's to come. The awakening of the Blue Throne is a call for new generations to reclaim their space in the sea of knowledge, politics, and spirituality without asking permission from those who tried to erase us. There are secrets that still sleep beneath the sands and mysteries that the waves haven't yet fully revealed to us, but the portal to truth has already been opened, and what's to come may forever change how we see tomorrow. And so, like the tides that always return to the sand, our journey through the waters of time finds its port. What we saw today was not just the history of ships and battles, but the awakening of a memory that refused to die, even under the weight of salt and oblivion. The legacy of these African navigators is a silent prophecy that reminds us the roots of our greatness are as deep as the ocean and as vast as the horizon they dared to conquer. Many mysteries still slumber beneath the Mediterranean seabed and the sands of the Sahara, awaiting the moment when we are ready to hear their voice. But the greatest revelation lies not in stone ruins, but within you, in the courage to question what has been erased, and in the reverence for a past that still pulsates in every beat of your heart. May this story serve as a beacon so that you never again feel small before the immensity, for you are the rightful heir of kings who made the sea bow down. If this wisdom resonated with your soul, don't let it be lost to the wind. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so that we can continue together, unearthing the secrets of African civilizations and honoring the light of our ancestors. Share this revelation with those who also need to awaken the power they carry in their blood.